All right, so you guys have been sending in some seriously interesting stuff. We're talking excerpts from Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that book that's basically become the Bible of personal development. And we're diving deep.
That's right. Deep dive into this classic to pull out the absolute gold, those key principles that can fast-track you to understanding what it really means to be effective.
This isn't just some abstract theory, is it? It gets real, hits home for anyone trying to make their lives, their relationships, even their work just better, more fulfilling.
Exactly. We're unpacking some of Covey's foundational concepts, the difference between, say, the personality ethic and the character ethic, the huge influence of paradigms, and then how personal growth and how we connect with others, it all happens in a very specific sequence. It's all about those underlying patterns driving real effectiveness.
All right, let's jump right in. Covey starts by sharing a very personal story. He felt like he was generally in control, that his ideas were solid. But there's this nagging feeling like something wasn't quite right.
He was bothered by this question, of what people truly thought of him deep down, like beyond the surface level.
And it wasn't just at work. He talks about his marriage losing its spark, becoming, and I quote, flat. No huge conflicts, but that deep connection they once had just wasn't there.
Tried counseling, tried different things, but nothing seemed to really rekindle that spark. They were, in his words, deep problems that just weren't responding to those surface-level solutions.
And then there was his son, who was facing some pretty significant challenges at school, socially, even in sports. They were really invested in helping him, pouring energy into encouragement, trying to build his confidence.
Yeah, really embodying that parental responsibility, right? I mean, They were all about positive reinforcement, skill coaching, even stepping in when other kids were teasing him.
But it wasn't clicking. Their son seemed to get more discouraged, convinced he just wasn't capable. And that's when Covey and his wife realized something wasn't working. Their efforts, as well-intentioned as they were, weren't having the effect they'd hoped for. They needed a new perspective.
A new way of seeing things. Totally. Now, at the time, Covey was deeply involved in leadership development, designing communication and perception programs for IBM executives. And this work really got him thinking about how we form our views of the world.
He was immersed in these theories about self-fulfilling prophecies, like the Pygmalion effect, where expectations can actually shape outcomes.
Exactly. That's where he started to grasp how deeply ingrained our perceptions are and how they really do shape our reality. It's not just about positive thinking. It's about the lens we're looking through.
So he had this pivotal realization: we need to examine the lens through which we're viewing the world, not just the world itself.
That lens, our individual perceptions, they dictate how we interpret everything around us. It's like we're all wearing different colored glasses.
Exactly. And as Covey and his wife reflected on their son's situation, they started to see a real disconnect. Their actions, although well-intentioned, weren't lining up with their deeper perception of him, and that was affecting their relationship.
And they realized they had this underlying belief that he wasn't measuring up, that he was somehow behind his peers.
And no matter how positive they tried to be, that fundamental perception was coloring their every interaction with him, almost like their unspoken doubts were louder than their encouraging words.
Powerful stuff. And this personal struggle, combined with his professional research and his deep dive into success literature, it led to a huge aha moment. He recognized the widespread influence of what he called the personality ethic.
And he contrasts that with something much more fundamental, something he felt had been kind of overshadowed by all the emphasis on quick fixes and surface-level techniques: the character ethic.
He saw this gap between the popular advice of the day, often focused on superficial changes, and the deeper principles he knew were at the heart of true effectiveness. It's like we traded depth for speed.
Covey's not saying that personality development, communication skills, or positive thinking are unimportant. He acknowledges they can be valuable, even crucial in certain situations, but they're secondary, like building a house on a shaky foundation.
Exactly. We get fixated on building the visible structure, those skills and techniques, and we neglect the foundation that holds it all up: character. It's like we've been harvesting for so long without planting, we've forgotten how to sow.
Imagine trying to influence people to get them to like you or perform better when your character is compromised, maybe by dishonesty or insincerity. Covey argues that, long-term, this approach just doesn't work. It's like building a sandcastle at high tide.
The tide will inevitably come in and wash it away. That lack of genuineness breeds distrust, no matter how good your techniques seem.
No matter how polished your delivery is, if it's not based on that bedrock of trust rooted in character, there's no real lasting success. It's like cramming for an exam. You might get by, maybe even get good grades, but you never truly master the subject.
And he draws this parallel to the law of the harvest. You can't skip planting in the spring and expect a bountiful harvest in the fall just by cramming them. Farming follows natural laws, and he argues those same laws apply to human behavior, to our relationships.
It's about aligning ourselves with those deeper principles. In the short term, maybe in artificial environments, you might get away with charm and superficial interest.
But in the long run, those tactics alone don't build lasting relationships.
Okay.
They have no real depth.
Exactly. And when challenges come, and they inevitably do, our true motives are revealed. If we're lacking that integrity, that character strength, things fall apart. The mask slips.
He talks about how many people achieve what he calls secondary greatness, the recognition, the accomplishments, but they lack that primary greatness of character.
And sooner or later, this imbalance shows up in their relationships. It's like a beautifully decorated house with a cracked foundation. Eventually, it's going to crumble.
Right. And that brings us to this idea of paradigms, those fundamental assumptions that shape how we see and interact with the world.
And the character ethic versus the personality ethic, those are prime examples of societal paradigms, aren't they? He defines a paradigm as a model, a theory, our frame of reference, the way we see the world, not just visually, but how we understand and interpret everything around us.
It's deeper than just an opinion. It's the lens through which we perceive reality. He uses this really insightful analogy paradigms as maps. We all know the saying, the map is not the territory. A map just represents certain aspects of the territory, right?
So imagine trying to find an address in Chicago using a map, but it turns out the map you're holding is actually of Detroit. It's clearly labeled Chicago, but it's the wrong map.
You could put in more effort, be super efficient in your route planning, even drive faster, but you just get to the wrong destination quicker.
You could even try to have a more positive attitude about being in the wrong city, but the fundamental problem isn't your behavior or mindset, it's that you're operating with the wrong map.
Exactly. And that's how powerful paradigms are. The closer our paradigms align with correct principles, the more accurate our maps are, the more effectively we can navigate life. And this applies to every area, from our personal goals to our relationships.
Having the correct maps makes a much bigger difference than trying to change our attitude or behavior while still using a flawed map.
Now that brings us back to the appeal of the personality ethic. It promises quick and easy solutions to life's challenges. Who wouldn't want that, right? But it often bypasses the real work of growth.
It's like those get-rich-quick schemes promising wealth without the work of building value. It might give the illusion of success for a while, but it doesn't address the deeper issues. It's more about appearance than substance.
Covey quotes Eric Fromm, who described this kind of person behaving like an automaton, lacking self-awareness, just going through the motions, putting on a synthetic smile to mask their inner emptiness.
And Fromm suggests that this individual, so focused on external expectations rather than inner values, isn't so different from many of us, actually. It's a sobering thought. But Covey emphasizes that growth, real development, it happens in stages in every area of life.
Think of a child learning to walk. They roll over, sit up, crawl, then finally walk, then run. You can't skip steps in that progression.
This principle applies to everything: learning to play piano, becoming a better communicator, building stronger relationships. It's a universal principle.
And we get this when it comes to physical development, but with emotional growth, character development, it's harder to accept that there are no shortcuts. But trying to skip those steps always leads to frustration.
It's like that average tennis player thinking positive thinking alone will magically transform them into a pro, or someone who's barely touched a piano pretending to be a concert pianist. It just doesn't work.
If you're at level 2 and you want to get to level 5, you have to go through levels 3 and 4. You can't just jump ahead.
It's also about being honest about where we are in that development. If you're trying to learn something new, you have to be willing to admit what you don't know. Trying to pretend you're further along just holds you back.
He tells a story about a friend whose daughters felt hurt by their father's harshness. They longed for his love, but couldn't be open with him. It created this real barrier in their relationship.
And the father, he understood good communication in theory, but wouldn't acknowledge his own role in the situation. His pride prevented him from taking that first step towards real change.
And he points out that truly effective relationships require learning to listen deeply and empathetically. It's not just hearing words. It's about emotional strength, patience, a real willingness to understand. These are all character qualities that take time to develop.
Our level of development is obvious in skills like tennis or piano. You can't fake expertise. But with character and emotional growth, it's easier to put on a facade. We might fool ourselves for a while, but those close to us usually see through it. It's that authenticity, that genuineness that really matters.
You see this in businesses where they try to buy a new company culture with superficial changes like motivational speeches without addressing underlying trust issues. It's addressing the symptoms without dealing with the cause.
And when those superficial methods fail, as they inevitably do, they just jump to the next trendy technique. It's a cycle of ignoring those deeper principles that actually build a healthy, collaborative environment.
Covey even tells a personal story about his own daughter at her birthday party. She was struggling with sharing her new toys, and he, feeling the pressure of being a human relations expert, jumped in to lecture her about sharing.
But it was the wrong time and place. The atmosphere was charged, other kids were waiting, his daughter was feeling possessive. He realized later those emotionally heightened moments are the worst times to try and teach a lesson.
It's much more effective to have those conversations later in a calmer setting when the relationship is good. Sometimes we need to let those heightened emotions settle before we can really connect.
This leads to a really key insight. The way we see the problem is the problem. People see positive results in others' lives and immediately want the techniques they're using without understanding the deeper principles at play. They're looking for that quick fix.
And those quick fixes might offer temporary relief. It's like taking a social aspirin for a deeper issue. The symptoms are masked for a while, but the root cause remains unaddressed.
He revisits the example of the manager frustrated by employee disloyalty, despite all the training programs, the person feeling overwhelmed by lack of time, despite time management seminars, the marriage lacking intimacy, despite counseling. The personality ethic would suggest external solutions.
But Covey asks, what if the individual's own paradigms are at the root of the problem? What if it's the manager's view of their employees, the person's perception of time, or the individual's beliefs about marriage that are contributing to the issue? It's about looking inward first.
He quotes Einstein, "The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. We need a new level of understanding."
And that's what the 7 Habits offer, a principle-centered, character-based, inside-out approach.
Inside out means starting with yourself, with
Yeah.
your paradigms, your character, your motives. It's about working on the roots, not just the branches.
It's about becoming the kind of person who naturally creates a happy marriage, who fosters cooperation in their children, who inspires trust in their colleagues. It's about prioritizing character over personality.
And Covey says that private victories, those commitments we make and keep to ourselves, must precede public victories. You can't genuinely improve your relationships before you've done the work on yourself.
Inside Out is a continuous process of renewal based on those natural laws of human growth. It's an upward spiral towards greater independence, leading to effective interdependence.
In all his experience, Covey says he's never seen lasting solutions come from an outside-in approach.
It's always people blaming external factors for their unhappiness, couples expecting the other to change first, conflicts fueled by the belief that the problem lies solely with the other side.
He even talks about global conflicts, like those in South Africa, Israel, and Ireland. That outside-in thinking, where everyone believes the other side needs to change, keeps those conflicts alive. It's refusing to see our own role in the situation.
And this inside-out shift, he says, is a big one for most people because we're so conditioned by the personality ethic, by that focus on quick fixes.
And now he introduces this idea of habits, those ingrained patterns of behavior that shape our lives. He defines a habit as the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire.
To have a habit, you need to know what to do and why. Knowledge, how to do it, skill, and you need to want to do it, desire. All 3 have to be there.
Think of ineffective communication. You might dominate conversations without realizing that listening is a vital skill. And even if you learn the techniques of active listening, it won't become a habit unless you actually want to listen, unless you value understanding other people's perspectives.
It's about aligning those 3 elements, knowledge, skill, and desire. And he describes this process as an upward spiral of growth. As we work on our knowledge, skills, and desire, our being changes, which in turn changes how we see the world, leading to even more positive changes in our being. It's this self-reinforcing cycle.
But it's important to acknowledge that change can be tough. It often means confronting old patterns, challenging our comfort zones. It requires connecting to a higher purpose, being willing to delay gratification for something more meaningful in the long run.
He then brings in the concept of the maturity continuum, this journey from dependence to independence, and finally to interdependence.
We all start as infants, totally dependent on others. As we grow, we gain independence physically, mentally, emotionally, financially, until we can take care of ourselves. And in many cultures, that's seen as the goal.
But Covey says true independence, while important, isn't the end game. Independent thinking isn't enough for truly effective living, for building meaningful relationships. It doesn't account for the interconnected reality of life.
It's like trying to play tennis with a golf club. The tool isn't suited for the game. You're limiting your potential.
Interdependence, that's the more mature stage. You're self-reliant, but you also recognize that collaboration with others allows you to achieve far more than you could alone.
And that interdependence opens up possibilities not just for greater productivity, but also for deeper, more fulfilling relationships. But it also brings greater potential for pain, for challenges.
It's a choice, but it's a choice that can only be made by someone who is already independent. And that's why those first 3 habits, be proactive, begin with the end in mind, and put first things first, they're so essential.
They're about developing that self-mastery, moving from dependence towards independence. Those are the private victories, the foundation. And then habits 4, 5, and 6, they're about the public victories, effective teamwork, cooperation, communication.
You don't need to master those first 3 perfectly before moving on, but a certain level of self-awareness and personal responsibility, those hallmarks of independence, are key for true interdependence. You can't effectively collaborate if you haven't got your own act together. You need a strong base to build on.
Now, Covey introduces this concept of the PPC balance, P being the production of desired results, think golden eggs, and PC being the production capability, the thing that produces those results, the goose that lays those golden eggs.
He gives the example of this guy in charge of a valuable machine who was obsessed with maximizing output to impress his bosses. He ran the machine nonstop, neglecting maintenance. Short-term production was great, lots of golden eggs.
But the guy who took over inherited a broken-down machine. The previous guy had basically destroyed the asset that produced the results by neglecting its care.
This balance is super important with human assets too, your customers, your employees. He gives the example of a restaurant that watered down its famous clam chowder to cut costs and increase short-term profit.
Profits did go up initially, but then loyal customers stopped coming, trust eroded, and the business declined. They focused on production at the expense of production capability.
This applies to our personal lives too, right? The person who burns the candle at both ends might be productive initially, but they burn out eventually. Or in relationships, always pushing for your own way might give you short-term gains, but damages the relationship itself.
Covey says the PPC balance isn't just a good idea, it's the very essence of effectiveness. It's about sustaining those results long-term, not just getting the quick win.
Before moving on to the individual habits, he offers some advice on how to best approach the book itself. Don't just read it through once like a novel. Treat it as a companion for growth, something to revisit.
Read through it once to get the overall picture. Then focus on individual habits as they become relevant to your current situation. Come back to it as you evolve.
And he encourages a shift from being a passive learner to becoming a teacher. Read each section with the intention of sharing what you've learned with someone within 48 hours.
That teacher mindset really deepens your understanding, improves retention, increases motivation. It also can shift how others perceive you. It shows you're serious about growth.
He then quotes Marilyn Ferguson. "No one can persuade another to change. Each of us guards a gate of change that can only be opened from the inside. It's about our own willingness to change."
Covey assures us that opening ourselves to the principles in the 7 habits leads to evolutionary growth. It's gradual, but the cumulative effect is revolutionary. It impacts every area of our lives.
He talks about how the first 3 habits, those private victories, lead to greater self-confidence, deeper self-knowledge, more inner-directedness. You're less concerned with what others think.
And those next 3, the public victories, lead to healed relationships, increased trust, and collaboration. Your connections become deeper and more authentic.
And the 7th habit, that's about renewal. It strengthens all the other habits, leading to true independence and effective interdependence. It's about regularly sharpening the saw so we can continue to grow and improve.
He reminds us that our current habits don't define us, that we have the power to change, to replace negative patterns with more effective ones. And he encourages patience and self-compassion in this process. It's a journey, not a race.
He wraps up this intro with a quote from Thomas Paine. "That which we obtain too easily, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only which gives everything its value. Meaningful change requires effort and commitment."
And that brings us to habit 1. Be proactive. Covey says this means taking responsibility for our choices and our actions, rather than just reacting to external circumstances or our feelings.
He shares Viktor Frankl's experience in the Nazi death camps. Even in those unimaginable conditions, Frankl realized he still had the freedom to choose his response. His inner freedom couldn't be taken away.
Covey then distinguishes between proactive language like I choose or I will, and reactive language like I have to or I can't. Our language reflects our mindset.
And he acknowledges that feelings are real, but says proactive people are driven by their values. They choose to subordinate their feelings to those values. He uses the example of making love a verb, expressing love through actions, regardless of the ups and downs of feelings.
He introduces the circle of concern, those things we care about but can't control, and the circle of influence, things we can do something about.
Proactive people focus their energy on their circle of influence, working on what they can change, and this expands their influence over time.
Whereas reactive people stay stuck in their circle of concern, blaming external factors, which actually shrinks their influence.
They become more and more powerless, more at the mercy of things they can't control.
He goes back to the story of his son's struggles. Initially, their focus as parents was on their circle of concern, his weaknesses, how others treated him.
But that led to frustration and powerlessness. They weren't focusing on what they could change. It was only when they shifted their focus to their circle of influence, to their own paradigms and their parenting approach, that things started to shift.
By taking responsibility for their own part, they were able to influence the situation positively. And he notes that even people in positions of authority can still operate reactively from that place of emotional myopia. They might have the power to make changes, but they don't exercise that power effectively because they're focused on the wrong things.
It's like having a fancy car, but refusing to learn to drive. You have the potential, but you're not using it.
So he breaks down problems into 3 categories: direct control, indirect control, and no control. Direct control problems are about our own behavior.
Indirect control are about other people's behavior. And no control, well, those are the things we can't do anything about.
But the proactive approach starts with our circle of influence, regardless of the type of problem. With direct control problems, we work on our habits. With indirect control, we change our methods of influence. And with no control problems, we accept them and choose our attitude.
It's about focusing on what we can do, not dwelling on what we can't.
He shares this example of an executive with a very dictatorial style. And this other individual in the organization, instead of complaining or trying to change the president, focused on their own work, on becoming so valuable that they became indispensable.
That's proactivity in action, right? They didn't waste energy trying to change someone else. They focused on what they could control and built their own influence. And eventually that influence allowed them to have a positive impact on the organization, even without directly confronting the president.
It's important to note that being proactive doesn't mean being aggressive or pushy. It's about being smart, value-driven, understanding how things work, and then working within that framework to achieve your goals.
Think of Gandhi. He led a movement for social change through nonviolent resistance. He expanded his circle of influence through compassion, not aggression.
Covey then talks about this distinction between haves, the things we desire, often in our circle of concern, and bees, the character qualities we can cultivate, firmly within our circle of influence. He says, thinking the problem is out there is the problem.
It's a trap we fall into. The proactive approach is to change from the inside out by focusing on who we be.
He uses the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, sold into slavery, unjustly imprisoned, but he remained proactive, focused on his character, on his integrity.
And eventually, he rose to a position of power in Egypt. He didn't let his circumstances define him. He focused on what he could control, his own being.
It's easy to blame external factors, but we are, as Covey says, responsible. We can influence our circumstances by working on ourselves. In a troubled marriage, for example, focusing on becoming a better partner is far more proactive than criticizing your spouse.
It's taking ownership, right?
Okay.
It's about focusing on what you can bring to the table, not waiting for the other person to change.
And he even says happiness is a proactive choice. It's about choosing our responses, focusing on what we can influence. He does acknowledge that consequences are in our circle of concern, even if our actions are in our circle of influence. He uses the example of a train. You can choose to stand on the tracks, but you can't choose whether the train hits you.
You can't control the consequences, but you can control your choices. And he points out that mistakes are also in our circle of concern. We can't erase them, but we can choose how we respond to them. We can own them, correct them, and learn from them.
And he gives some practical steps for taking control of our lives. Making and keeping promises to ourselves and setting and achieving goals. This builds self-trust, that inner integrity.
Those are the building blocks of proactivity, of taking charge of our lives. He then challenges readers to a 30-day proactivity test. Work only in your circle of influence. Make and keep small commitments. Be a light, not a judge.
Focus on solutions, admit and correct mistakes, and stop blaming external factors. He ends this section with a quote from Samuel Johnson. "The fountain of content must spring up in the mind, and he who hath so little knowledge of human nature as to seek happiness by changing anything but his own disposition will waste his life in fruitless efforts and multiply the grief he proposes to remove." It's a reminder that true happiness comes from within. So, are you ready for habit 2?
Bring it on. I'm intrigued to see where this goes.
All right, habit 2 is begin with the end in mind. This means starting with a clear vision of your desired outcome. It's about having that destination in mind before you start the journey.
Covey uses the analogy of building a house. The first creation is the blueprint, that mental image of the finished house. It's got to be clear before you even start laying bricks, otherwise you'll make costly mistakes.
It applies to everything, designing a family-centered home, starting a business, raising children. It's about defining what success looks like before you start taking action. If you're planning a trip, for example, you decide where you want to go before you start booking flights.
Or if you're designing a garden, you have a vision in mind before you plant the seeds. It's about being intentional, not just letting things happen by default.
Covey says all things are created twice, but not all first creations are by conscious design. If we lack self-awareness and responsibility for our first creations, we're essentially letting external forces shape our lives. We're living by default.
And those external forces can come from family, from society, from our own insecurities. It's like we're following someone else's script instead of writing our own.
He then introduces this idea of leadership versus management. Leadership is about vision, direction, doing the right things. Management is about efficiency, doing things right.
He quotes Peter Drucker. Management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. It's about effectiveness versus efficiency.
He tells the story of this oil company president who was buried in management, constantly putting out fires, until he realized he needed to shift to leadership, to focusing on the bigger picture. And that led to a much healthier company culture and improved performance.
It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and just managing tasks.
Yeah.
But without that leadership, without that vision, you can end up like those people rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Very busy, but ultimately headed for disaster. He suggests that even as individuals, we can fall into that management trap, focusing on goals and tasks before clarifying our values, what truly matters to us.
It's about getting clear on our why before we get lost in the how. Covey reminds us that we have this incredible capacity for imagination, for visualizing our potential. And we have our conscience, that inner compass that guides us towards our unique contribution.
It's about using those gifts to consciously design our lives, to write our own script.
He then talks about different centers that our lives can revolve around. We could be spouse-centered, family-centered, money-centered, work-centered, possession-centered, pleasure-centered, friend-enemy-centered, self-centered, or principle-centered.
In our center, that's our source of security, guidance, wisdom, power. It affects how we see and interpret everything. But each center has limitations. Being spouse-centered, for example, makes you vulnerable to your spouse's moods. Being self-centered can lead to isolation.
And being principle-centered, that's the most stable and effective center. It's about aligning our lives with timeless, unchanging principles. He used the analogy of compass. If you're trying to navigate, you need a stable reference point. Principles provide that stable reference point for our lives.
Covey then introduces the idea of a personal mission statement. It's like a personal constitution, a clear articulation of what you want to be and do based on your deepest values and aspirations.
It's not something you invent. It's something you discover. He suggests that we each have this unique mission, this potential contribution that's already within us. It's about tapping into that inner wisdom.
He stresses the importance of proactivity in defining our mission. Our meaning comes from within, from taking responsibility for our lives. It's not something that's given to us, it's something we create.
If habit 1 was you are the programmer, habit 2 is write the program.
Writing a mission statement is a deep process, and it takes time. It's not about just jotting down a few goals. It's about reflecting on your values, your purpose, what you want to leave behind.
He even suggests imagining your own funeral. What would you want people to say about you? What would you want to be remembered for? It's a powerful exercise for clarifying what truly matters.
And once you have that mission statement, that clear picture of your desired end, Covey suggests using visualization and affirmations to align your daily life with your values. It's about bringing that vision into the present moment.
He gives some guidelines for creating effective affirmations. They should be personal, positive, present tense, visual, and emotional. It's not just about repeating empty phrases. It's about creating a powerful emotional connection to your desired outcome.
He uses the example of a parent who wants to be more patient with their children. Instead of just saying, I'm a patient parent, they might visualize specific situations where they tend to lose their patience
Right.
and see themselves responding calmly and lovingly.
And that consistent visualization helps reprogram the subconscious mind, making it more likely that you'll actually act in accordance with your values in those challenging moments. It's about bridging the gap between intention and action.
He then circles back to that distinction between leadership and management. Effective management, habit 3, requires living a life that's congruent with the vision established through personal leadership, habit 2.
It's about aligning our actions with our values.
He uses the maxim. Manage from the left, lead from the right. The left brain is analytical, logical, focused on efficiency. The right brain is more creative, intuitive, concerned with the bigger picture.
And he introduces the fourth human endowment, independent will. This is our ability to make choices and act on them. It's what allows us to actually carry out the program we've written through self-awareness, imagination, and conscience.
Think of Helen Keller. Blind and deaf from a young age, she could have easily succumbed to her limitations. But she chose to live a life of purpose and contribution, achieving remarkable things. It's a testament to the power of human will.
Covey says enduring success comes from using our independent will in everyday decisions, measured by our integrity, the value we place on ourselves, our ability to make and keep commitments, to walk our talk.
Effective management is about putting first things first, and that's determined by our leadership, by our vision. It's about prioritizing what truly matters, what's aligned with our mission, and then having the discipline to act accordingly.
And that discipline comes from within. It's about being a disciple of our own deeply held values and subordinating our impulses to those values. He quotes E.M. Gray's essay, The Common Denominator of Success, where Gray found that the one thing successful people had in common was the habit of doing things that failures don't like to do.
So it's not about finding.
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to me and helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.